How are you all doing?
Welcome back to our spot.
I'm Cass.
And I'm Driz.
Come on in and take a seat, take your shoes off, get comfortable.
Yeah, we're really excited. This is our second episode. Thanks for listening again. And today we are bringing to you another topic that's dear to our heart. You guys know that in the first episode, we kind of introduced our friendship and how we came about together and what brought us together and what makes a good friendship.
Yeah, so we mentioned that we met at CODA. And so today, within our topic, we are going to talk about codependency, hyperindependence, and interdependence.
Yeah, and this is interesting because we kind of came about this topic through a conversation of our own personal lives. We were talking about something we were both going through, and we kind of saw the relationship between codependence, hyperindependence, and what that middle ground looks like. So we are excited to kind of dive a little bit into this topic today and explain a little bit of what it is, give some definitions, give some resources. As we mentioned, we are both very science-based, so we are trying to give you all some type of references that you can go back and do your own research and see how it all applies to your own life. And with that, we are giving a little disclaimer to make sure that as we're speaking about these topics, neither Cassie nor I are mental health professionals. We want to make sure that we are putting that out there. We're very passionate about health, but neither of us are any type of licensed medical professionals.
No, this really has to do with topics that we find interesting, our own life experiences, finding some research, right? So we research these topics, find some good literature and or videos on the topics, and then we kind of just explain our findings and our opinions based on that. And so we're excited to start today. We're excited to shake things up with you guys and talk about this.
Yeah, so let's dive in. So as you guys know, Cassie and I met through CODA, which is a program that we both love and are part of and hold dear to our heart. It's how we met, and it's something that we continuously try to be involved in because it has given us and continues to give us a lot of good resources and support. And with that, through the group, we both kind of learned what is codependency. So what is codependency?
So I think that when people think about codependency, they usually see it in a partnership, an intimate relationship, and they will pinpoint it and say, oh, like this person is attached to this person in an unhealthy way, right? And we're going to steer away from attachment styles. But whenever I think about codependency, I really see it as a neglect of self. I see it as a neglect of self and one's own boundaries based on trying to please others, and sometimes based on like a form of control, like trying to control outcomes and situations. That's my own personal working, definition of it. What do you think, Driz?
Yeah, I agree with that. And the actual Google definition of codependency is an excessive preoccupation with the lives, feelings, and the problems of others to the point where you neglect yourself. So basically, your identity and the way that you deal with things is very outwardly. You're worried about everybody else except yourself. And like Cassie said, a lot of times we see codependency talked about in relationships, like a partner relationship or, parent-child relationship. But honestly, you can be codependent with substances. You can be codependent with hobbies. You can be codependent with so many other things that are not just people. And all of these things ultimately do impact the type of relationship you have with yourself, which is the most important relationship, right? And the basis of our podcast is how we can improve ourselves to then have healthier relationships and that to extend to a healthier community. So yeah, codependency, it's just like that obsessiveness with everybody else as a way to ignore your sense of self.
Right. Yeah. And what's really funny is that I don't know if it's funny or not, but there are many different attributes whenever it comes to codependency, right? So Driz kind of just outlined, like you could be codependent with different things, not just people, and definitely not just like in an intimate relationship. but it's these attributes that are really kind of coinciding with codependency that, you won't be aware of until you actually recognize it, right? Like you'll have to do a little bit of digging and reflecting to be like, oh, wow, I was thinking this when I was doing this, or I keep doing this. Why do I keep doing this, right? And what I've found in my own personal experience and from going to different meetings and reading different literature is that these codependent tendencies, these attributes, these characteristics are usually formed because of thought processes and because of family systems. So it's usually kind of this like aftermath of being brought up in a certain way. And then as a child, you begin believing these certain thoughts, which become patterns into your adulthood.
Yeah, you bring up a good point because when I first started going to Coda, I remember learning about codependency. Actually, it was my therapist who mentioned it to me and gave me this book called Codependent No More by Melody Beattie. It's a book from like, I don't know, the 70s or the 80s. And I
So good.
remember, yeah, it is. And I remember when I read that book, like, I just looked at my therapist and I was like, how have I never known what codependency was? And I like was having a session with her and I was like, I'm a codependent. And then once I started attending the meetings, I thought that was so funny because one of the things you do in the meeting is like literally like a 12-step meeting. You kind of say like, my name is Driz and I am codependent. So once I saw that reality, I started to question, obviously, because that's kind of what I do, but I started to question, what is codependency? How does codependency show up in my life? And one of the questions that I remember bringing up to myself was like, is codependency even bad? We're all codependent. As humans, we all in some way relate to things and people and resources of the earth. So is there something wrong with codependency, right? And I think going back to the attributes that Cassie was saying, things are neither black or white. Things are neither right or wrong. However, it's when you're engaging in a certain behavior, what are the consequences and what are the impacts of those behaviors? And what I have found also in my personal life through my journey of codependency is realizing it's not so much that codependency is bad or good. It's that ultimately the result is as a way for me to disconnect to myself or as a way to avoid looking inward because it's bringing up an experience of trauma or an unhealthy coping mechanism. So some of those attributes that we have as codependents, and this is something that we have a literature book that we read through the CODA program. It's literally called Codependence Anonymous. And on page 44, it talks about some of these behaviors. And what I find interesting about these behaviors is that they're very human tendencies. We all do this in one shape or form. And I'm talking about 3-year-olds all the way to 80-year-olds. These behavior traits that I'm going to read are things that we do as humans naturally because we're human, because we make mistakes, because it's just part of like our human nature. I would even dare to say it's like a survival thing. But it's like, again, once these behaviors become obsessive to the point where you aren't yourself or you're using it as a way to like negate or cover up issues is where things start kind of becoming problematic. So I'm going to read some of these just off the list. Again, we'll put the resources on our link tree on our Instagram page, but some of these codependent behaviors can include lying, manipulating, avoiding, denying, passiveness, aggressiveness, resenting, raging, silence, victimizing, abandoning, judging, neglecting, distancing, punishing, discounting, offending, bitterness, abusing, enmeshing, hypervigilance, overcontrolling, overpleasing, teasing, helplessness, shaming, hating. Again, I think all of us can probably identify with at least one of these behaviors on here because we are humans.
And it's not a one size fits all, right? So I definitely can relate to a lot of those. And I'm going to talk about an article here in a moment and get into some of their key findings, which has to do with attributes and characteristics of codependence. But whenever it comes to being bad or good, it's kind of like what Driz said. If you're at least to each his own, right? So if I'm neglecting myself to appease someone else or what I think will actually please someone else, and it depends on the extent. Like we all people please to a certain extent, right? And we all want to be valued by one person or another to a certain extent, but is it to the extent of, for me personally, how I see it is, am I getting my worth overall from someone else, right? Is my worth dependent on someone else and how they view me? And and that's a hard question to ask yourself. For me personally, that's whenever it's doing more harm than good. If my worth is directly tied to how you view me and your response to me and how I am pleasing you, then there's probably it's probably pretty negative.
Yeah, and I get it. It goes back to, when does being codependent become a huge problem? And goes back to that definition where it's becoming this like obsessiveness, where the only way you find worth and the only way you're learning to connect to people is by being codependent, right? And I think about children. I worked with a lot with kids, and lying. Lying is something that kids do naturally. Why does a little boy or a little girl lie to their mom or dad about eating the chocolate? As a simple way so that they don't get punished, because they're ashamed that they did something bad, or just simply because they don't want their mom or dad to know. However, they're using that lying as a way to maintain connection with their mom and dad. So if I do something, I'm 3 years old, and I do something that maybe my mom and my dad are going to get mad at me, I'm going to lie, because I know that if they get upset at me in some ways, that's going to affect the connection that I have with my mom and dad. And again, these are things that are subconsciously done. However, when does that lying go to a point where the only way you're having relationships with people is because you're lying or using some of these behavioral traits? So that's kind of where we see codependence on one extreme. All of us are codependent in some ways, right? If you think about a spectrum or like a line, codependency is on one side of that spectrum. And then I know Cassie had some stats, so she wanted to share about that before we move on to the other section of it.
Yeah, so I found this really interesting article that is, again, available for you all to read on your own. It's titled "Codependency in Family Systems with Distorted Communication Patterns and Their Manifestation in an Individual's Social Behavior." It's a mouthful. The article is by Hapon and Vok, who I apologize if I am butchering your names. So actually, these are two professors. One is a philosophy professor, and one is a psychology professor in Ukraine. I think Kyiv, if I'm not mistaken. And so these two professors did a study with 112 people who have experienced staying in distorted family systems. And I'm sorry if we omitted this earlier, but usually codependency is known. I feel like it's pretty infamously known to be a byproduct of growing up in an alcoholic like family system, which isn't always the case, right? And with this article specifically, they talk about distorted family systems, but alcoholism has to do with some of the people, right, that they had in their study. Some of them were raised in an alcoholic family. So there are a few things that I really found interesting. First of all, like I said before, my only experience with codependency is my own patterns and reflections and realizations, and then, obviously attending meetings. So kind of like this really like social environment. So being able to research this and then find some academic studies that have been done on this and kind of read their findings and understand them, I thought that was really interesting, right? So they go into different theories of codependency and distorted family systems and some things that are, well above my head. And one thing that I really liked was that they highlighted 4 stereotypical views of the world in a child that is raised in a distorted family system. So the first one is, I am the cause of parental alcoholism. I have to do something about it. The second one is I'm not like everyone else. The third one is I should constantly control myself and all my circumstances. And the fourth one is someone will come or something will stop and all this will change. And I just found that very powerful. I don't know if anyone else can relate to that, but for me, I definitely can relate to 2 and 4 growing up. And the other thing I wanted to say about their work in this article specifically is that they also, in their key findings, they had this list of attributes slash characteristics of codependent adults, right? And so I'm just going to list a few of these. There's many more listed in that article, which is a pretty easy read and again is available for you all. So one is anxiety. Another one is that people with a high propensity for codependency they are more capable of managing emotions and that they have a more pronounced ability for empathy. They are more likely to experience frustration. They have higher rates of rigidity in their emotional states. They have a lower adaptability rate, and they attach more importance to the value of power, meaning prestige and social status and so forth.
These things because we were raised by parents who were, a lot of them were in survival mode. And I think just understanding, like the article says, a lot of codependency literature does focus on people with alcohol use or alcoholism in families, but that may not 100% always be the case. You may have experienced families who your family did not deal with that. However, there was a lot of manipulation going on or other things that caused you to kind of doing things by myself, working at an early age. And for me, it was a way of never needing to be disappointed by the people around me. I learned that if I do it by myself, there's no room for error, or if there is, I'll deal with it myself. And that was a result of just constantly being disappointed by the adults in my life and those people that are around me. And as a result, it just taught me that, well, if I can't rely on anybody, the way to avoid being disappointed is to do it by myself and have this very hyper independent mentality of I don't need anybody, which is also not healthy. And I don't know what your experience with hyper independence is, Cassie.
Yeah, so I just wanted to quickly note that if you look up the definition of hyperindependence on Google, if you type it in there, what's going to pop up, the very simple definition is that it's a behavioral pattern where someone is extremely self-reliant and avoids asking for help even when it's needed. And so I'm going to get into my experience, but first I really want to kind of pay tribute to Alexis Fernandez, who we listened to her podcast for this episode, Do You Fucking Mind? And she talks about her experience with hyper independence and it stemming from being hurt in a relationship. Her personal experience is being hurt in an intimate relationship. And I think that I wanted to start off with that. First of all, to pay tribute to her in that episode, because it was really clear in my mind after listening to that that's exactly what has happened to me. That's how I can relate to hyperindependence. It is really kind of this pendulum swing, right, from codependency and then being hurt in some kind of relationship by being vulnerable at one point or another, and then making the decision, okay, I don't want to be hurt again. I don't trust anyone. I'm not going to be vulnerable with anyone. I can do everything myself. Look, I'm independent. And I think that can be really troubling. Like it can be, especially in the 2024 and the society that we live in today, the society that I live in, and my personal perspective is that this can be a problem, right? We can't do everything. I cannot do everything on my own. I need help. And, in order to really build the relationships, the kind of relationships that I want to build, there has to be trust. There has to be communication. I have to be able to be a little bit vulnerable and ask for help sometimes. Not everyone can do everything alone. And if we lived in a world like that, I don't even know what that would look like. It'd be sad. everyone would be completely unempathetic to everyone around them and just out for themselves. What do you think, Driz?
Yeah, that's how, as you were sharing that, sadness, I think, is what I would think, at least in my experience too, is when you're very hyper independent and in that energy and that type of mentality and mode, it's just sad because we're not meant to be alone. And in some ways, we kind of already live in a society that praises individualism versus the collective, which we did talk a little bit about in episode 1 as well. And when I say society, Cassie and I are both in the United States, Maryland, excuse me. So we are speaking from a very, I don't want to use the word nuance, but our perspective is coming from the United States in the Northeast. We live in a very individualistic society mentality area. And I think we are seeing the repercussions of what it looks like to live that way. And it is sad. And I think it attributes a lot to a lot of what we're seeing being like a lot of what we're seeing outside of like the depression and the loneliness epidemic and just the lack of fulfillment and happiness that we as humans are experiencing, especially from our generation. Both of us are millennials. So again, coming into this with a lens from our point of view and how we have experienced hyperindependence and life and what we're experiencing currently, right? So yeah, so then that brings us to what's the middle ground look like, right? On the spectrum, you have codependency, where you need all these people and you need to do all these things in order to maintain connection. And then on the other spectrum, you have the hyperindependence, which is where you kind of act like you don't need anyone and you try to do everything by yourself, ultimately resulting in possible things because we do need people. So what's the middle ground? And that's kind of where in our conversation, Cassie and I were trying to find, what's the definition of the middle ground? And honestly, we didn't really find too much concrete information on this, but from the things that we've read and the podcast that we have listened to, we found this term called interdependence. And I think it's something that's being more talked about now, but it's that middle ground between those two spectrums where how can you have a healthy relationship while maintaining connection to yourself and a healthy connection to others? And yeah, I don't know if we had like an actual definition for it. Yeah.
Yeah, so this was something that whenever I was looking into it, I found interdependence pop up a lot whenever it came to different industries and organizations. So like the health industry in terms of interdependence, or education industry or organizations. But whenever it came to relationships, not too many like academic studies I found to do with this, like any social studies. But I'm sure they're out there. I just didn't find them. But I did find this article on Psychology Today by Kara Garden Swartz, and it's about interdependence. And she says that interdependence acknowledges the inherent interconnectedness of individuals and celebrates the strength found in collaboration. So in interdependent relationships, partners embrace their vulnerabilities, share responsibilities, and draw strength from each other's unique qualities. Through open communication and genuine reciprocity, they cultivate a sense of belonging and unity while maintaining their individual identities. And this is that middle ground, right? Like this is, I feel like, our sweet spot, or my sweet spot. It's what I'm trying to get to. And I think, I do just want to say a couple of things. So the first thing I want to say is that I believe that hyperindependence is a cause for concern, because not only are we living in a society that fosters individualism, but they celebrate and relish that I can do bad all by myself, right? I can do this all myself. I can be like, it's not even like it's celebrated. It's this thing to be, it's an accomplishment to do everything by yourself. And to me, that's a problem. And interdependence is the complete opposite of that, right? Where it's just like, okay, no, like you can ask for help and you can communicate and you can actually draw strength in that way, right? I will make my life, and I have made my life so much harder at times just because I'm so hard-headed and I'm in that hyper independent state and I'm fearful, right? I'm fearful of getting hurt and I have trust issues, right? So I don't want to ask for help. And again, it's made my life harder. And so I think that middle ground, the center where I'm striving to go is that into interdependence, right? And being able to be vulnerable, and trust others and ask for help whenever I need it. And just knowing that I don't have to do everything alone and I can't do everything alone. And I do just want to say really quickly that the language of letting go today was actually perfect because it talked about peaks and valleys and kind of how you can go into these highs or like these extremes of codependency and then maybe even to the opposite spectrum like hyperindependence, but you have to kind of go swing into each of those extremes in order to get to that middle ground. And I really liked that because it made me feel like, okay, well, I can and have done these extremes and maybe now I can settle into that, center space.
Right. And ultimately, we're all looking for the same thing. We all want healthy relationships. We all want connection. We all want to feel love. We all want to feel supported. And we can go about getting those needs met by being codependent. We can go about getting those needs met by being hyper independent. But what we're realizing is those spectrums don't really give us an authentic relationship building. And how can we find the interconnectedness of building relationships with others in a healthy way while also maintaining a healthy connection to ourselves and not losing ourselves, right? So, and that's the goal. That's the goal here. Build healthy relationships with others, build healthy relationships with ourselves, and ultimately have community that we can rely on and that we can all support each other because we're not here alone.
Yeah. I also just wanted to mention that Driz and I, sent our first episode to a few people in order to get some feedback because your feedback is extremely important for us, right? I mean, what your opinions are and how you feel about certain things, and also just to get more information from you is extremely important to us. And I did just want to say a couple things. So the first thing is that we're talking about the strength and community, and our first episodes we talked about friendships and relationships and community and how important it is, and that is very central to our podcast, the whole reason why we're here, right? And I think we might have mentioned something about capitalism and our individualistic society, and that theme might come up again, but in no way, shape, or form are we condoning anything but capitalism, right? We're not even touching on that actual structural system, our economic system. We are just talking about socially and about social dynamics, relationship dynamics, and how we want to interact with others in the world. And it's based on our experience. And so our perspectives are probably a lot different than most of yours, right? And that's okay. We're here for it. We're here to listen to different perspectives, and it's a safe space. And that's kind of what community also is all about. Driz, you want to add on to that?
Yeah. So obviously we're not going to sit here and say, oh, we're not talking politics, because politics intersects with everything, and we're not ignorant to that cause. And it would be very privileged to sit here and say that politics does not impact us. However, we're not condoning any type of system, and we are speaking from our experience. So yeah, with that, I think we're going to conclude our second episode. Thank you guys so much. We hope that we have given you some food for thought in your own life, and for you to explore how your experience with codependency and hyperindependency is, and how in some ways maybe challenge you to look inward to see, how are you building an interconnection with those in your life and with the habits also that you have in your life, and moving forward, how to continue creating healthier relationships with that.
So thanks for joining us, and we look forward to hearing from you all, hearing your feedback and any ideas that you may have for us.
Yeah, and remember, follow us on Instagram. Our handle is podcast our spot, and interact with us. We're going to be there posting some questions, getting feedback from you all, and again, want to build a community of trust and safety.
Until next time.
Bye.